Congratulations, you made it to one of my very favorite subjects, how organisms influence the chemistry of surface waters, or how the biology influences the geochemistry. Or to put it another way, what is the field of biogeochemistry? So biology has been in the background of the previous ways that water is modified that we've discussed, such as interactions with minerals in soils, in bedrocks, and in the atmosphere. But now we're going to really bring biology to the foreground and see what a central role life plays in altering the geochemistry of systems. So let's jump right into that. By the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to understand how organisms control water chemistry via their stoichiometry. And you might not be familiar with discussing the stoichiometry of organisms, but I'm going to get you familiar with that. Secondly, I want you to describe how organisms control water chemistry through their energetics, and I'll also explain what that means. And then finally, I want you to list 3 major ways that humans alter water chemistry. So let's get to it. Again, we've discussed soils, rocks, and the atmosphere, and now we're moving on to this bottom part, discussing how organisms and humans, which, you know, they're organisms, but we're special. How humans also influence water chemistry. So let's get right to it. Microbes and plants first. So a key point to understanding how organisms modify the chemistry of water is to understand that organisms are made up of fixed ratios of elements, or relatively fixed ratios of elements. And so what do I mean by this? Well, take the example of a human. A human is, you know, I think we say we're 70% water, 75%, whatever you learned in PE class. I did poorly in PE class. But if you go below that 70% water, you're going to have a bad time. You might die. If you go above 70%, your body's going to work overtime to pee out that water so that you maintain this relatively level amount of water in your body. And the same is even more true for other elements. So if you consider maybe a desiccated human being, don't think about a desiccated human being too hard, but think about a human that has all of its water left from it, and you're just considering the dry parts of humans. That human contains elements in a pretty tightly constrained ratio. And the reason for that is that the molecules that build up our body have set stoichiometries. So just like an atom or a molecule can have stoichiometry, sulfur dioxide has a stoichiometry of 1 part sulfur to 2 parts oxygen. Our proteins have pretty well fixed stoichiometries. And our proteins are what make up different parts of our bodies, and our fats have pretty well defined stoichiometries. So a human being is just kind of a sum of all these stoichiometries of these macromolecules, and that results in organisms having a fixed stoichiometry. So a human has, I think, on average about 50% body carbon. Your body is like, I think, 30% oxygen, some 14% hydrogen, 8% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 1% sulfur. And those are the big elements that compose you. But you're composed of a lot of other different elements. Those are just the major ones. And so your body is, in a sense, can be considered one giant molecule with a fixed formula with very, very large numbers written in the subscripts. But if you deviate from that, well, you can't deviate from that. You would never find a human that's 30% nitrogen, because that would imply that there's some weird molecules that are very, very rich in nitrogen that just don't exist in our anatomies. And so everything that we do, all the food that we eat, is driven towards growth by these elemental ratios. So if you want to bulk up in muscles, which contain a lot of nitrogen because they contain proteins, proteins are amino acids, amines are nitrogen-containing compounds, you eat protein, and that increases the nitrogen content in your body, which allows you to synthesize nitrogen-containing tissues. And all other organisms are driven the same way. Plants and microbes also go out into the environment, seek out the elements that they need to build their bodily tissues in these fixed ratios. And this is the idea of elemental stoichiometry, or organismal stoichiometry. And if you're a microbe or if you're a plant, the way you do this is you go and seek out these elements from water. So right here I have illustrated a system of microscopically fine plant roots that are surrounded by a bunch of microbes. And these plant roots are going out into the environment and they're absorbing phosphate and nitrate and things that plants need to build up their leaf tissues. These microbes also have a fixed ratio of nitrogen to phosphate in their bodies, so they're also absorbing these nutrients in those same ratios. They're also taking up organic carbon. Microbes need organic carbon to survive just like we do. We eat food, they eat organic carbon as food. Plants obviously don't do this because plants get their carbon from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. But these microbes in these plants are modifying the water chemistry by taking up organic carbon and taking up phosphorus and nitrogen so that they can grow and replicate. So they're directly impacting the water chemistry via their stoichiometric demands. And a great example of this comes from where I did my dissertation research up in New Hampshire, a place called Hubbard Brook. And I'm going to describe an experiment to you that took place in the 60s. You can't do this kind of experiment anymore. What they did was they took a watershed and they monitored this watershed for a few years to see how much nitrate was coming out of it. And you can see here on this graph, the y-axis is nitrate concentration and the x-axis is time in years. And then after a few years of monitoring this watershed, what they did, so they looked in the stream, looked at the nitrate concentrations, monitored it over time, and then after a few years, they clear-cut the entire watershed. So they cut down every tree in the watershed. And then they sprayed herbicide on it. They sprayed Agent Orange, the same stuff that was used for chemical warfare in Vietnam. They sprayed it on this watershed for 3 years to determine what would happen to elemental concentrations, and we're looking at nitrate here, if you removed all plants from an ecosystem. So, to start off, you'll see that nitrate concentrations in the stream water are very low over time. Starting over here, very, very low. And the reason is plants were taking up this nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen in their leaves, so they took it up and they made leaves out of it. And so that decreased the amount of nitrate that was in the water supply, so when water flowed out of the soils into the streams, it was relatively low in nitrate. But at this red arrow right over here, this is where they clear-cut the watershed, and as soon as you remove the biota from the watershed, or the plants at least, you see that the nitrate concentrations went through the roof. So all of a sudden, tons more nitrogen was exported from this watershed, and this was in large part due to the fact that plants were no longer taking up nitrogen. There was no longer demand for nitrogen, so nitrogen wasn't being removed from the water in the soil, so all this water freely flowed out of the watershed, just loaded down with nitrate. So this is a great example of how biota alter water chemistry. You can see over time, it came down. Once they stopped spraying herbicide on the watershed, the plants regrew, and after 10 or 15 years, it was back to their baseline nitrate concentrations in the watershed. So organismal stoichiometry determines how organisms modify the chemistry of water as those organisms seek the chemicals that they need to be able to grow and reproduce. So that's how organismal stoichiometry affects water chemistry, by organisms taking up the elements that they need to grow and reproduce. Now I want to discuss a little bit about organismal energetics. Now what do I mean by this? Well, this is how organisms gain energy for themselves to produce ATP and do mechanical work and chemical work in their bodies, just like we do. We eat food, we breathe in oxygen, that food gets transformed into sugars, which eventually go into our mitochondria, combine with that oxygen, and give us energy, and we respire carbon dioxide. And the same thing happens with all organisms. And if you're a microbe or a plant, you're doing this in an aqueous system. So a microbe will take up organic carbon. That could be dissolved organic carbon, carbon already in aqueous solution, or it could be particulate carbon, you know, a little chunk of a leaf. And they'll also take up oxygen from the water. So they're removing these two things from the water, and they'll do their respiration, and they'll produce carbon dioxide. And so they're both adding and subtracting from the water in terms of its chemistry in order to do their basic metabolic function, which is acquire energy through respiration. And this is an example of aerobic energetics, or aerobic metabolism, metabolism that happens in the presence of oxygen. And plants do the same exact thing, except that plants don't need to get carbon from the environment, or at least they don't need to get organic carbon from the environment, because they fix carbon through their leaves, photosynthesis, send sugars to the roots. The roots take up oxygen from their surrounding air and soil water, and they produce carbon dioxide, which can then dissolve back into that soil water. So both plants and microbes are constantly exchanging metabolites with the environment. And this is also true for marine organisms and for freshwater organisms. I just chose this soil example because it's the example that I am most in love with. So this is what happens in the presence of oxygen. These are aerobic energetics. Aerobic means in the presence of oxygen. But biogeochemistry gets really interesting when you start getting into systems with the lack of oxygen. And these are called anaerobic energetics. So the story of aerobic energetics is very simple. Carbon and oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. But as soon as you take oxygen out of the picture, things get wacky. And you can have organisms, they're always going to be taking up organic carbon. This is done only by bacteria and archaea, anaerobic metabolism, which necessarily require an external carbon source. So they're always still going to be taking up organic carbon. But the other molecules that they use to process this carbon are numerous and very different from each other. You have nitrate, you have iron, you have manganese, you have sulfate, you have hydrogen. Lots of different energy sources or sources of reactants for these metabolic reactions that result in anaerobic energetics. And what do they spit out on the other side? They're spitting out iron 2+, they're spitting out carbon dioxide, they're spitting out methane, they're spitting out nitrous oxide. So you have a very, very boring aerobic chemistry. Sorry, aerobic chemistry. But a crazy and very exciting anaerobic chemistry. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this class focusing on what happens when you don't have oxygen in water and how that drives the production of a ton of different chemistries in these systems mediated by biota. And that's the subject of redox chemistry. And redox chemistry in the environmental sense really should be considered redox biochemistry, because almost all the time microbes are really what is driving these reactions. So this is another example of how microbes are organizing the solutes that you find in water. Through the acquisition of energy, they take up some products and release other products. So I might have said that anaerobic microbes are nearest and dearest to my heart. But that's not true. Of course, my mother is nearest and dearest to my heart. Hi, Mom, love you. Followed by the other 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth, and then anaerobic microbes. And so I just want to touch a little bit on the role that humans play in this chemistry, because we play a big role. And I want to highlight particularly 4 very important pathways by which humans alter aquatic chemistry. So let's start with agriculture. The goal of agriculture is to grow plants, to grow them big and strong. And these crop plants are not immune to the laws of organismal stoichiometry that we just discussed. Crops require nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon in fixed ratios in their tissues. And so in order to get plants to grow as well as they possibly can, the whole strategy of modern industrial agriculture is to give them so many nutrients that they have no excuse not to just grow awesomely. And so we just flood fields with excess amounts of nitrogen, excess amounts of phosphorus, excess amounts of potassium, all sorts of other elements to fertilize plants, but those are the big 3. And we give them so much that the plants can't take it all up. And so what this results in is, just like in the Hubbard Brook example where plants couldn't take up the nitrogen because they'd all been cut down, we flood these fields with nitrogen and the plants can't take it all up, so all this nitrogen ends up in our water. And so this is how agricultural pollution is produced by excess fertilizer. In addition to fertilizers causing agricultural pollution, there are also a lot of pesticides and herbicides that can persist in the environment and be pretty nasty. So there are also some organic contaminants that arise in natural water samples due to the presence of agriculture. The next way that we can really screw up the earth is industry. Industry, we produce metals. That involves a lot of burning of ores and such, which releases smoke. We combust a lot of fuels to do industry. We produce a lot of nasty chemicals, like organic chemicals, that when it's convenient, we find ways to dump them into our waterways. And so industry is a prime suspect in the ways that humans modify environmental chemistry. The main impacts that we have are through metals and organics, but industry is very diverse, and there's a laundry list of ways that industry can impact water quality. Not saying that industry is bad, just saying that they have a demonstrated impact on water quality. The next way that humans impact water quality is via sewage. We poop a lot. And you know, humans eat very tasty morsels. We're not out there on the Great Plains eating grass. We like to eat fruits and nuts and things that are very, very rich in the same elements that we put into our food. This nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so what happens is we have an excess of that in our bodies. So we digest our food and then we poop out a lot of these nutrients. So in our sewage, we have a ton of nitrate coming out. We have a ton of phosphate coming out. Of course, our feces is bulk carbon. There's a lot of carbon in it, in like fiber and stuff. So also producing a lot of organic carbon that needs to be dealt with. And so human feces and human waste is a major source of solutes to waterways that manifest themselves as pollution through sewage. And we try our darndest to mitigate these things. You know, we have wastewater treatment plants, as shown here, that do their best to remove nitrate, phosphate, and carbon from water. But there's always a little bit trickling into waterways, no matter how well these wastewater treatment plants work. And particularly in large swaths of the world that don't have advanced wastewater treatment facilities, we're just dumping raw sewage into waterways. And these are a major source of chemical solutes that you'll find in geochemical samples, just the nastiest ones. Another interesting aspect that's kind of emerging as a field of study nowadays is a study of how things like personal care products and what we call emerging contaminants are entering waterways. So these things include like cosmetics that have nanoparticles, a lot of nanoparticles that are involved in sterilization of things. Microplastics are a big thing. I'm sure you guys have seen news stories about like facial scrubs that involve microplastics and how all those microplastics make it into our waterways. So there are a lot of ways that humans modify water quality through their sewers, but nutrients are the big ones. And a kind of exciting new field of study is how these relatively understudied personal care products and household products like optical brighteners found in detergents can also modify water chemistry. Finally, the fourth category that I want to touch on about how humans modify water quality is one that kind of also encompasses all the other ones, and that's through water withdrawals. And the way that we can alter the solutes in waters via withdrawals is simply that when you take water away out of a system, you take water, say, to irrigate your farm, and agriculture is the big use of water. Far and away, agriculture is the dominant use of water withdrawals from groundwater and from surface waters across the globe. You take that water away, you water your plants with it, that water evaporates. That water is no longer left to dilute any solutes that exist in a groundwater system or any solutes that might enter into a groundwater system. And so just by removing the quantity of water, a concentration is moles of solute divided by liters of solution. You're reducing the denominator, you have fewer liters of solution, so you're therefore increasing the concentration of solutes. And so this is a really nice figure from a paper by Clay and Gradle. And what these authors did in this paper was they analyzed which elemental cycles on Earth are most impacted by humans relative to the amount of cycling that naturally occurs. So which elements are being vastly more mobilized by humans and being cycled versus what elements are relatively dominated by natural causes of cycling. And they organized this into a nice periodic table so you can examine it pretty cleanly. And black elements are elements that are dominated by humans. More than 50% of the cycling on Earth occurs due to human activity. Gray are somewhere in between, and the dotted ones are elements that have been relatively undisturbed by human activity relative to their natural cycling. So like you'll see nitrogen is relatively undisturbed. That's not because we're not putting a ton of nitrogen into the environment. It's just because there's also a lot of nitrogen that cycles naturally. But what I want you to notice is first, nearly all the periodic table is black. And this includes a lot of economically important things like iron, gold. It also includes a lot of really nasty contaminants like chromium, like copper, like arsenic. So humans have really mobilized a ton more of these really nasty contaminants into the environment due to human activity than would have ever occurred naturally. But yeah, I think this is a really nice demonstration that humans have really come to dominate the elemental cycling of a ton of elements on Earth, and this has pretty drastic implications for water quality and the kind of solutes that you see in aqueous geochemistry. So that's all I have for you in this lesson. We've kind of done a little tour of the landscape of water chemistry, why it's important, what you can come to expect when you look at a water chemical sample. And in these next lessons, we're going to kind of take a step back, and we're going to focus on the tools that allow you to examine water chemistry. The first one of those that we're going to examine is the tools of thermodynamics. So we'll jump into some thermodynamics. It'll be a quick thermodynamics refresher for you, and then we're going to move on to some applications of thermodynamics in real-world aqueous geochemical settings. So thanks for listening. Bye.